Hello and welcome to this look at Chen's Chapter 8, The Early Metropolis as a Place of Inequality. We're going to start our discussion today by examining this quote from Jacob Riis. Jacob Riis was a photojournalist in the late 1800s, and he worked primarily in New York City. He was a Danish immigrant himself, and he explored the lives of immigrants living in Lower Manhattan. His quote, "One half of the world does not know how the other half lives," is really profound. And I hope that this quote sticks with you as we cover the different examples here today. And I want you to take this quote outside of just this discussion in this course and really think about how place and space vary between different people and different groups, how our metropolitan areas are so diverse and complex that one person's experience and connection with those spaces could vary greatly from another. So in Chapter 8, our context is really going to be looking at, first off, segregation. We're going to define it, explain what it is, how we measure it, what are some of the outcomes of segregation. And we're going to keep this theme, one space, many places. Again, recall Jacob Riis's quote as we consider one space, many places. We're going to see how sense of place is based on the colonizer versus the colonized. So we'll look at earlier cities dating back 400 or 500 years, and see how these areas were established to reflect a power dynamic. We'll look at immigrants versus native born. We'll fast forward to the time that Riis was working and other authors like Charles Dickens, and how they came to understand cities from social classes. Again, are you newly arrived, or has your immigrant or ethnic group been here for a long time? And that level of tenure influences your prospects. We'll look at race again, something that we've covered thus far when we looked at Chapter 6 and talked about redlining. And we'll also look at how gender is really a key theme when we're defining space and place in our cities. So to begin, we'll talk about segregation. Again, segregation is a bigger theme that we could then include in our different examples. When we ask ourselves, what is segregation? We're really looking at the separation of different groups within a population. Now, this definition is pretty general, right? We could look at our separation of groups as simple as men and women's bathrooms or locker rooms in a gym. But it's much more complex than that. We're not just looking at some of the simple ways in which we separate our groups today. We're looking at a more complex version of segregation. When our groups become very clearly separated, when we look at issues of isolation and concentrated segregation, we refer to that as hypersegregation. And generally, communities that are hypersegregated are also those communities where we find a lot of social issues, where we find issues of poverty, crime, drug use, low education, teen pregnancy. So hypersegregation generally is going to carry with it some pretty negative connotations. When we look at the ways in which segregation is enforced, we talk about de jure segregation, and that's by law. This is an involuntary form of segregation. We examined this type of de jure segregation previously when we talked about redlining. We talked about how certain areas of our metropolitan area were off limits to certain groups. When we look at the apartheid in South Africa, we see how different racial classifications dictated who went where and who could use certain spaces. The other type of segregation is what's known as de facto, and this means that it is by custom or preference of those living there. This de facto segregation can be voluntary or involuntary. As we've previously discussed, oftentimes we have rules in place like redlining, and when redlining is overturned and deemed illegal, overnight we don't see this rapid move towards integration. So oftentimes our laws set custom, set culture, set preferences, so that when our laws are overturned, we simply don't see people moving back together. An example of this would be the ongoing segregation in a place like Northern Ireland, where legally the Protestants and Catholics aren't separated, but by preference they are. And it's really important that we recognize that the concept or the idea of separate but equal is a myth. We cannot get the most out of our society. We cannot get the most out of our communities if we are separating people along arbitrary or made up guidelines. When we look to measure segregation, we do so in a few ways. One of the most common ways to measure segregation is what's known as the index of dissimilarity. And the graphic on your screen illustrates this index. You'll notice that 0 to 30 reflects low segregation, 30 to 60 reflects moderate, and 60 and up reflect high segregation. Now, what the index of dissimilarity does is it examines the racial breakdown of your metropolitan area. So if you have a relative split of 50-50, say, they're going to look at how many people from a certain group need to relocate within your community to make that 50-50 split. In a hyper-segregated city or a hyper-segregated community, we're going to see the value of this index upwards of 90 and 100. So for example, a city like Baltimore is about 40% white, 60% black. That's the aggregate. But when we dig deep, we recognize that very few of our neighborhoods come anywhere close to that. Only about a handful of our neighborhoods reflect the citywide racial breakdown. So in some of our neighborhoods that are almost exclusively black or exclusively white, we're going to see a high value to this index, meaning that we would have to move or shift a large portion of that population out and replace it with the other racial group. Two other measures look at exposure and isolation. Exposure reflects how likely you are to encounter somebody of the same race in your community, and isolation looks at really the same measure, just in different terms. Isolation says how likely are you to come across somebody of a different race in your community. So this is how we generally measure segregation in different communities. And this index of dissimilarity is a pretty useful tool to understanding the difference between segregation and hypersegregation. So with these tools in place, we're going to look at this idea of one space, many places, and see how our groups are segregated and how that leads to different advantages, how that creates a power dynamic. Our first example takes place in colonial cities. And when we talk about colonial cities, again, we're looking at primarily Western European powers that spread their empires around the world. In doing so, they established cities that demonstrated power and authority, and they kept groups separate. So as they established these new colonies in the major cities, they had no intention of integrating the native population with the colonizing force. So as we'll look at in a couple examples, this power and authority is clearly demonstrated with how these cities are built. British and European colonial powers, which settled North America, but also settled Latin America and much of Asia and Africa, used some tools, some systems to impose different hierarchies, where it's made very clear that depending on your origin, depending on your race, depending on your loyalty to the colonial power, your opportunities, your life, where you live in a city, will be determined by those factors. These colonial powers, they replaced, they in many sense, they just simply wiped out the existing communities in place and built their own developments. The Spanish employed what's known as the law of the Indies in Latin America. And when we look around Latin American cities today, we recognize a lot of aspects from the law of the Indies. They have very distinct grid setups with the key institutions at the center. So the center of our Latin American cities that were established by the Portuguese and Spanish looked at putting the church, the religious institution, in the center of government, near the center. And if you were of a higher rank, higher up that social hierarchy, you are more likely to live closer to these key institutions. You're more likely to live in a nicer home. You're more likely to have a better job. And oftentimes this is simply dictated by your origin. So were you born of blood or born in the country that is colonizing, or are you loyal to that colonial power? First example that we'll look at is Dutch Manhattan. And important quote from the Chen book: cities are laid out by the rulers, not the ruled. And that's pretty evident when we look at Dutch Manhattan in the 1600s. This area was known as a cantonment, and this area right here, and what's Battery Park today, was a protected fort for the Director General Peter Stuyvesant, and this area, this compound, kept others out. So what you would have had Stuyvesant or the other Director Generals on the inside, and then you would have everyone else outside. So you would have merchants, you would have people from Europe living within that developed area of Lower Manhattan. And the area I pointed out is a canal cutting in that reflects the Dutch development in this area, where the Netherlands and parts of Amsterdam are dredged and canals are put in for transportation and trade. The Dutch used those ideas to create a new footprint in Lower Manhattan, really wiping out what was there before. So you can see again the signs of the colonial power: the protected fort on the lower tip of the island, the canal that reflects where they come from. So within this area, we saw high levels of segregation. The walls that incorporate some of what is known as Wall Street today kept outsiders out. So this was a very rigid form of segregation. Walls, physical barriers to keep outsiders out, while for the most part, early free market capitalism was taking place within those walled areas under the guidance of the Netherlands. A second example brings us to Bridgetown in the Barbados in the Caribbean. And there was a scramble for control of the Caribbean in the 16, 17, and 1800s. And the Barbados reflects that British Empire, what's known as a metropole. This was a city for exporting to support the empire. So Bridgetown would export rum and sugar and molasses. Today, it's become an international center for investment, for tourism. So the British that set up this very ornate capital city, again, a metropole is an exporting center for a colonial power. As the British set up this ornate city that attracted early investment, that was the home of the British colonizers and the colonial loyalists, later on became a center of investment. So as Barbados gained some autonomy, this area remained of key importance. And again, you can see the money, the investment that's found in Bridgetown today. Bridgetown is also known as a primate city, where it's disproportionately larger than any other city within the country. But in this case, it's really home to about 40% of the population and almost the entire economy. As you move away from the metropole, you see examples of poverty. You see some legacies of that early colonial segregation, where the investment again is focused on that colonial city, that metropole, where other areas of the island nation suffer. They lag behind, and you can see it in the buildings. There are fewer economic opportunities. Those that are limited, so their social mobility is limited, are often stuck in these areas that lack investment and lack opportunity. And again, this is common in a lot of our former colonial port cities, particularly in the Caribbean.